Well, hello and welcome to the Quadruple D. So, there are many different issues I could talk about on this podcast. For example, former Prince Andrew has been arrested over the Epstein scandal. We are apparently on the verge of war with Iran. There are babies being deported, and all sorts of other issues. But in this episode, I'm going to be looking at authoritarians, strongmen, and the politics of so called peace and who is gathering around Trump right now. So, more than 20 governments have reportedly signed on to Donald Trump's newly announced Board of Peace. Well, it's not totally newly announced, but it's relatively new. It's a body that he personally chairs and directs. Its first meeting in Washington has drawn representatives from a range of governments, including regimes widely criticized for crushing dissent. So imagine that. Maybe he's getting them some uh, you know, attention. He's getting them some positive press, and maybe he's getting some pointers from them on how to crush dissent here in the United States. And while billed as a vehicle to reshape Gaza after Israel's devastating military campaigns there, Trump has described the board in sweeping terms as the most consequential international body in history. Wow, that's a very bold claim. And it really shows his ambitions that stretch far beyond a single conflict, right? It's like he's got additional conflicts in mind. So the board includes Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Mabouli, and I will focus on Egypt primarily in this episode just because it's as good an example as any, and I'm not going to get into all of these different countries here. It's going to be mostly a focus on Egypt as an interesting example. So, in a way, this is like the Egypt episode. And also present is Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar. I might not be pronouncing it correctly. We also have Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, or Fidan, however that's pronounced. We've got Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet. And interestingly, Manet might be there because he nominated Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. So it's a little bit of a, a sign that Trump might be giving preference to people who are willing to kiss his rump in public. And I do have to say about Cambodia. I actually once interviewed Muni Norodom, a Cambodian prince and actor and musician who had a role as a character named Danny in the 2024 Prime Video musical film 1660 Vine. So I've actually interviewed a Cambodian prince, so that's a little bit strange because eventually in one of these episodes, maybe I will talk about Cambodian politics. But at the time, I was trying to get um, an interview with somebody who I just couldn't uh, arrange an interview with, so I got to talk to this star of 1660 Vine instead. And yeah, and he is a Gen Z member of the Cambodian royal family working in Hollywood. And it was interesting to talk to him, but I'm going to move on because that's an aside here. There's also Indonesian President Subianto. We've got Kazakh President Tokayev, Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif, and Uzbek President Mirziyoyev. So I'm probably butchering that name too. But anyway, the very structure of such a body is telling when it comes to this Board of Peace. It's got as an idea, the core principle here, power centralized in one figure for all of these countries, and they're, you know, authoritarian in many instances, operating outside accountable international frameworks, and populated by states whose own domestic records reveal deep hostility to grassroots democracy, at least in many of these cases. Well, possibly all of them, but I don't need to get into that debate uh, right now. And people are saying that the initiative appears designed to bypass the United Nations, an imperfect but multilateral forum, and replace it with a selective coalition shaped by loyalty and financial contribution rather than popular legitimacy. So, several U.S. allies are reportedly uneasy about the project's implications. Some governments, including Italy and Greece, are said to be sending observers rather than full delegations, and the attendance at the inaugural meeting, it's a it's interesting, and there are concerns that the board's authority rests less on international consensus and more on executive discretion and loyalty to the orange doofus. So let's talk about Egypt a little bit as the example here. They are not really a free country, they are under military rule. Among those confirmed to attend this meeting of Trump's weird organization is Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli. And Egypt's political climate has been extensively documented by watchdog groups. In its annual Freedom in the World report, Freedom House assigns Egypt a score of 18 out of 100, designating it not free. So 18 is a pretty low score for a country to get. The organization describes a system in which civil liberties are tightly restricted, independent media is stifled, and security forces act with impunity. Since seizing power in a 2013 military coup, President El Sisi has consolidated authority through constitutional changes, mass arrests of political opponents, and the expansion of military influence in the country. Thousands of political prisoners are believed to remain in detention, and human rights groups have documented enforced disappearances, torture allegations, and the criminalization of peaceful protest. So, again, I think Trump might be interested in getting some handy pointers from this character. And Egypt's inclusion is not incidental, but emblematic. The regime's survival has depended on centralized force and international backing, like that of the orange one, and that's taking the form of substantial U.S. military aid, over $1.3 billion annually in recent years, and that such a government would be invited to help design a post war political order. I think it reveals the contradiction between rhetoric about peace and the lived reality of repression. So, it's a lot about militarization here, militarism, and instead of multilateralism. So the so-called Board of Peace's formation occurs against a backdrop of devastation in Gaza following Israel's military operations, which have killed hundreds of thousands and destroyed significant civilian infrastructure, and it's also displaced large portions of the population. It's a genocide, and rather than working through established diplomatic channels, the new body appears structured as a top-down initiative dominated by Washington. And the danger lies not merely in who is invited, but in the assumption that durable peace can be engineered by state elites meeting behind closed doors, and international institutions already suffer from democratic deficits. Substituting them with a leader centered club exacerbates that problem. When Trump frames the board as historically unparalleled, critics hear echoes of, uh, a braggart and, the strongman politics that uh, so much dominate authoritarianism. It's a club of convenience here. Observers, they've noted that some governments may be participating less out of ideological alignment than pragmatic calculation, maintaining access to U.S. power or avoiding diplomatic friction. Yet the concentration of military regimes and autocratic systems among the founding members is difficult to ignore. So, these various governments, whether they're liberal democracies or overt dictatorships, they share a structural reliance on coercion, and that's really one of the main elements here. So some of the countries on the list are considered relatively free. They're relatively democratic, and there's also you could always say there's been a debate over what exactly constitutes a dictatorship. But I think the signs are pretty clear, and it seems like a lot of these supposed liberal democracies are more easily lending themselves to dictatorial aspirations these days. So the Board of Peace, as currently constituted, seems less a break from the pattern of dictatorship and a rebranding of it instead. And without meaningful participation from affected communities, particularly Palestinians themselves, any settlement risks reflecting the priorities of these authoritarian states rather than the needs of any people on the ground. So, if peace is to mean more than the absence of open warfare, it must involve dismantling systems of cruelty and domination rather than reinforcing them. A gathering of rulers, however grandly titled, does not by itself move the world closer to that horizon, and in fact, it's in many ways a bad sign. So, on to the second segment of the show, the poop head of the week, which is Abdel Fattah el Sisi. So, he is the leader of Egypt, basically. He's uh, since 2014, and he's a former general who became the country's sixth president. And his rise demonstrates how military institutions preserve state power regardless of electoral outcomes. And the path to his presidency began after the 2011 uprising that forced Hosni Mubarak from office. And in 2012, Mohamed Morsi won Egypt's first competitive presidential election. Shortly after that, Sisi was appointed Minister of Defense and Commander in Chief of the Egyptian Armed Forces, replacing Field Marshal Hussein Tantawi. And less than a year later, in 2013, Sisi announced that the military had removed Morsi following mass protests against his rule. And supporters of Morsi, including members of the Muslim Brotherhood, had organized large sit ins demanding his reinstatement. But that didn't work. In August 2013, security forces violently cleared two major protest camps in Cairo, and the Rabaa massacre became one of the deadliest mass shootings of demonstrators in modern Egyptian history. Human Rights Watch concluded that the killings likely amounted to crimes against humanity, estimating that at least 817 people were killed at Rabaa alone in a single day, with the overall death toll from the dispersals reaching into the thousands. And Egyptian authorities arrested roughly 19,000 people in the aftermath, targeting various activists, journalists, and political opponents. And Sisi resigned from the military and ran for president in 2014. He won the election and was sworn in that June. And subsequent elections in 2018 and 2023 were marked by the absence of meaningful competition. Potential challengers were arrested, pressured to withdraw, or sidelined through legal mechanisms. So turnout figures and results were officially high, but independent observers and human rights groups characterized the political environment as heavily controlled. And of course, if you're cracking down on any opposition, well, of course it's going to be authoritarian in nature. So his government has systematically restricted civil society. Tens of thousands of political prisoners are believed to be held in Egyptian jails, including secular activists from the 2011 revolution, journalists, lawyers, and members of banned organizations. Independent media outlets have been blocked, and laws governing NGOs impose tight state supervision. Torture, enforced disappearances, and prolonged pretrial detention have been documented by international rights organizations. Human Rights Watch has stated that Sisi's rule relies on naked coercion and the dominance of military and security agencies. So, the Egyptian military's economic role has also expanded significantly under Sisi, and armed forces affiliated companies are involved in construction, food production, infrastructure, and consumer goods, operating with limited transparency and exemption from many taxes and oversight. So, mega projects such as the expansion of the Suez Canal in 2015 and the construction of a new administrative capital east of Cairo have been presented as national development efforts, but these projects also deepen debt and concentrate wealth among military linked elites. So Egypt's external debt has risen sharply over the past decade, and inflation and currency devaluations have eroded living standards for ordinary people. So elements of Sisi's governance have been described as even more repressive than the Mubarak era, despite Mubarak's nearly 30-year rule under emergency law. In 2019, constitutional amendments extended presidential term limits and increased military influence over political life, further entrenching executive authority. So, yeah, in 2024, Egyptians launched an online dignity revolution campaign that sparked street protests against economic hardship and political repression. Authorities responded with mass arrests, one of the greatest hits, and expanded surveillance. Hundreds were reportedly detained in preventive sweeps. Analysts have labeled Egypt under Sisi the sick man of the Middle East, pointing to economic instability, high youth unemployment, and growing public frustration. So, what do you know? These dictatorships, they lead to public frustration, and they don't really care that much about the population. I've noticed a pattern about that over the years. And for the third segment of the show, the fetid fever dream flashback of the week, and we're looking at Mohammed Morsi. We're sticking to the Egyptian aspect. And the biggest scandal involving Mohammed Morsi depends on what you mean by scandal. Many Egyptians who opposed him would point to one moment above all, however. That was the 2012 Constitutional Declaration. In November 2012, Morsi issued a constitutional declaration that placed his decisions above judicial review, beyond judicial review, and in practical terms, it meant the courts could not challenge his decrees. He also moved to shield the Islamist dominated Constitutional Assembly from being dissolved. So, for his supporters, this was a temporary measure to protect the revolution from remnants of the old regime linked to Hosni Mubarak. But for his critics, it looked like a power grab, and protests were exploding across Egypt, and the move deepened polarization and damaged his legitimacy, setting the stage for the 2013 military intervention led by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, which removed him from office. So, other major controversies during his presidency, if you look at them, they include pushing through a constitution seen as favoring the Muslim Brotherhood, accusations of suppressing dissent and prosecuting critics for insulting the president, economic mismanagement during a period of severe instability. But the November 2012 decree stands out because it symbolized for many a betrayal of the democratic spirit of the 2011 revolution. So the issue is less about Morsi personally and more about state power itself, in some ways, if you actually think about it. Uh, if you're skeptical of centralized authority in any form, you'll see that the 2012 decree would likely uh, not be a unique failure, not a unique moral failure, but a predictable outcome of state power. The office of president in Egypt already concentrated enormous authority, and Morsi's move to shield his decisions from judicial oversight could be viewed as the state revealing its core logic of power protecting itself. So, a serious critique might say that it shows how revolutionary energy can be absorbed into traditional state structures. Even leaders who rise through elections can reproduce authoritarian habits, and the struggle between elected officials, courts, and the military is still a struggle among elites over control of the same hierarchical system. You might say that one is a better outcome than another, and maybe there's some truth to that, but at the end of the day, it's all a risky gamble. So, in that view, Morsi's scandal is not just about him overreaching, it's about how any centralized political system creates incentives for leaders to consolidate authority, especially during crises. At the same time, a serious critic would likely extend the same criticism to the military's removal of Morsi. Replacing an elected president with military rule obviously does not decentralize power, it simply shifts who controls it. So, from that perspective, the episode reinforces a broader point that concentrating authority in a presidency, a court, or an army invites conflict and coercion. The scandal is less a story of one man's ambition and more a case study of the limits of state centered politics and how easily those can crush any genuine uh, revolutionary change. You know, the more things change, the more they look the same. And yeah, this is the type of person that Trump would want to hang around with. He can get some handy pointers from these strongman style leaders and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's about it for this episode. Probably wasn't the most exciting one, but I've also got like a cold or something right now, so you might have been able to tell. And yeah, all right. Have a good day.